It's possible that journalism has always been garbage. Yellow journalism has been around for a while, but today it seems like it's more obvious than ever. And I think the internet, the ability for us to communicate with each other, is making it easier for us to see through the facade. Now we can actually see that these journalists are not acting in our best interest, but it also is, as I mentioned in my video yesterday on my main channel, as these companies start whittling away, they start collapsing, they become increasingly unhinged, desperate to get voters, and as they shake violently, they start to, well, it gets worse. They drown, become more erratic, produce crazy content, hoping for clicks and viewers. It doesn't work. It just gets worse. Now, I mentioned this briefly on my second channel early this morning, but I wanted to take a look at what we're seeing from Jim Acosta, where he rejects neutrality for the sake of neutrality and says straight up that he absolutely does grandstand and some people don't like it. Jim Acosta may be the best example of how journalism today is people who have discovered they can just make themselves famous, make a ton of money, and that's what they're going to do. Journalism be damned. But we actually have some instances that highlight exactly why or how the media plays this game. Here's a chart here that was published by Our World in Data showing how the media is highlighting certain things because they want traffic. They want money. It's warping our view of the world. It's warping our perspective. So here's what we're going to do. First, we'll read a little bit about Mr. Jim Acosta and how he opens up to not being neutral and grandstanding on purpose. I'll show you some data, and we'll talk about how trust in media is down and how we can see now that no, journalism is not doing its job. It's actually failing. Before we get started, make sure you go to timcast.com/donate if you'd like to support my work. There's a monthly donation option, a cryptocurrency option, a physical address, but of course, like and comment. It really, really does help. Or just share the video, subscribe if you haven't already. So in this story from Mediaite, they say CNN White House correspondent Jim Acosta argued that neutrality in reporting is not effective in the age of President Donald Trump, as he lays out the current administration's unique attacks on the press in his upcoming book, Enemy of the People, A Dangerous Time to Tell the Truth in America. I really, really, really do not like this guy. I think he is one of the scummiest people in media, and I just got to say that because my disdain for this man will be palpable. According to a book excerpt published by The Guardian, Acosta writes that he opts for the bait during his countless viral confrontations with the president, which he admitted can constitute showboating or grandstanding from time to time, and that bothers some people. However, he argued that his style of aggressive questioning is necessary with Trump. Neutrality for the sake of neutrality doesn't really serve us in the age of Trump. One of the things that activists have been pushing, as long as I've been involved in this industry, is that there is no such thing as objective journalism. To me, this is the lie they feed to justify their rage bait content meant to make money, not make change. But activists have figured this out, that being a journalist affords you certain protections. And it's a bit nefarious, and it's unfortunate that they've been doing this, but they do. And it's not just on the left. You will see many right-wing personalities and activists now become journalists. Because as a journalist, they can claim, oh, you're trying to shut down, my journalism, and somehow it's more noble. It's unfortunate. To me, there are very few journalists actually left. A journalist is someone who says, look, man, here's what's happened. You figure it out. I feel like I kind of fit that bubble a little bit. I'm not perfect. I don't think I'm perfect. I just think when I look at Jim Acosta, he's somebody who wants to make money. He wants to sell a book. So he's yanking your chain, and he knows it. He even talks about grandstanding. There are many people who are activists who truly believe they're doing the right thing. And that's a little different. At least they have good intentions, albeit it's still wrong and destructive for society. But in this blog post from Our World in Data, we can actually see through the veil. Something really interesting, exactly how, or at least some data to show, the media is absolutely warping your view of the world on purpose. It makes them money. And I want to say, I don't necessarily blame. I think there's some important things to highlight here, but let's do it. This story talks about, does the news reflect what we die from? One of the primary motivations for our work at Our World in Data is to provide a fact-based overview of the world we live in, a perspective that includes the persistent and long-term changes that run as a backdrop to our daily lives. We aim to provide the complement to the fast-paced reporting we see in the news. The media provides near instantaneous snapshot of single events that are in most cases negative. The persistent, large-scale trends of progress never make the headlines. I'm not going to act like I'm not guilty of similar things. A lot of people they say they want good news, but do they really want good news? Because good news doesn't really it's not as shocking. It doesn't catch your attention. And we also kind of view good news as, yeah, okay, that's to be expected. Violence is down. Violent crime is down. The world terrorism, it's all down. All of these things are down. And you can report on that, but it's not a singular explosive moment. That's the big issue for many, many people. For me, I see things that I view are bad or that should be addressed, and I make videos about them. So I fall basically into a very similar camp as these news organizations, and it is a problem. I don't necessarily know what the solution is, because I feel a lot of the motivations of news companies are driven either by what an individual thinks is newsworthy, which can skew your perspective, what an activist thinks the world should be doing, or what someone thinks they can make money doing. For me, I kind of just talk about what I think is important. But again, I'm not going to act like I don't play a role in the media. But let's take a look at these stats. Causes of death in the U.S. Check this out. We can see here's the actual data in 2016. Cancer and heart disease are in the top. Here's Google searches. We can see that you can see violent crime and suicide are way bigger than they actually are. And cancer gets more searches than anything else. Heart disease is not even really searched for, 2%. Now here's the New York Times and the Guardian. Take a look at this. Terrorism accounts for less than 0.01% of all death. Yet it's 35.6% of media coverage from the New York Times. There's one simple reason. It sells papers. It really does. I believe there's some nuance to discuss. It's not black and white. It's not like they're only doing it for this reason. But we can see that violent crime and suicide are the predominantly focused on, and they overlook completely drug addiction and kidney disease. They barely, actually stroke is pretty appropriately represented, but even cancer and heart disease are not being represented in the media. What ends up happening then is you end up with people demanding policy based on what they see from the news. If the argument is that the news is supposed to protect us by informing us so we can make better decisions, they're not doing their job. So no, I'm not going to act like journalists are somehow the bastions of truth, the heralds of knowledge. It's not the case. They focus on things that will sell papers. Now, in terms of, it not being so black and white, well, there's a reason why violent crime gets highlighted, because these are things that are hard to predict, and if you know about them, you can predict them. So I do think it's fair to point out in some circumstances, highlighting these issues is important. If something is happening that could impact you, you need to know about it, especially if it's something that's unusual. That makes sense. However, it would seem that if they focused on cancer and heart disease more, they actually might save lives and allow people to better allocate their resources and energy into things that actually matter. But this is where we find ourselves. Now, it is also true that the cause of death isn't simply, I don't want to act like cause of death, issues like cancer need to be reported on, because as I mentioned earlier, it's not like they're a singular event that can be highlighted. People die from these things all the time. It's not going to inform anybody of anything. They're not going to learn anything new. It's like, yes, we get it. These things happen. How often can you really report on it? These other instances are anomalous, and I would argue it's actually fair in some circumstances in that we can do things to stop these causes of death. Cancer is much, much more difficult. But interestingly, in a report from 2017, this is a story. Well, let me scroll up to the top so you can see it. This is the Digital News Project, Bias, BS, and Lies. Audience Perspectives on Low Trust in Media from Nick Newman and Richard Fletcher, the Reuters Institute and University of Oxford. I don't think these are the best sources necessarily, but hey, it's Reuters and Oxford. What can you do? They say in this, main reasons behind different attitudes of the news media and social media, all countries. The news media does a good job in helping separate fact from fiction. 40% agreed, saying journalistic process, good storytelling, depth, and trusted brands. 25% disagreed, saying bias, exaggeration, sensationalism, and low standards. 35% were in the middle. The next question, social media does a good job in helping separate fact from fiction. No way. Only 24% agreed, saying that it was a broad range of sources, views, and authenticity. 41% said low quality, unreliable, no checks, agenda-driven, opinionated. But in reality, what they need to consider in this is that social media is the driving force for news today. That's what you need to realize. People will look to these trusted brands and they'll think it's okay. But look what we saw from Jim Acosta. He knows he's a grandstander and he knows he's not neutral. He's doing it because he gets the clicks. News exists on social media. Articles get shared on Facebook. Videos get presented on YouTube. You can't really share a YouTube video on YouTube. And Twitter is where people generate buzz for themselves. Brian Stelter of CNN said journalists have an unhealthy relationship with Twitter. They sit on Twitter all day, they grab tweets, they make stories about it. They'll find one tweet, they'll make it a story. And this is what's happening. So this first question, I think, is kind of pointless. It's the second question that matters. 41%, low quality, unreliable, no checks, agenda-driven, opinionated, and don't take my word for it. Time magazine columnist, Trump quote went viral, and then he admitted he made it up. This is a story from the Daily Caller, but I have covered it in the past couple days. Ian Bremmer made a fake quote where he said that he quoted Trump as saying Kim Jong-un is smarter and would make a better president than sleepy Joe Biden. The only thing is, he never said that. Trump never said this. Ian Bremmer, who is a columnist for Time, made it up, and journalists parroted this quote uncritically, without fact-checking. So this is where we start to see through the veil, and I think it's important to make this point. It's not just about people like Jim Acosta writing books where they admit it, where they admit they grandstand and opt for the bait and confront the president and they're not neutral. At least he admitted it. But it's also when you can see someone like this, man, were they angry with this guy? They were furious, saying, delete this. How could you? How could you do this? It's dangerous. You know what's dangerous? The journalists who did not fact check, who just assumed it was true. This is our era of journalism. People who grandstand and admit it, and people who just repeat lies they see, and there you go. That's the state of media. And yes, we can see this. This is a story from February. Trust in media hits bottom. 60% say sources pay for stories. We can see that according to this Columbia Journalism Review poll, of all these institutions, military, law enforcement, universities, Supreme Court, executive branch, the press, and Congress, the press has the least amount of confidence. Or more people say they have hardly any confidence at all in the press, more than any other group. Even Congress. And I gotta say, that's impressive. And the executive branch. So this is another really interesting metric, especially when you consider that you have the press repeatedly going after Trump. Well, as far as it goes with the executive branch, sorry, they trust the press less. Finally, we have this question that was raised by Neiman Reports. Where does journalism end and activism begin? Well, in today's day and age, unfortunately, journalism is over. It is. In fact, in this story, I mean, you can see exactly what these people do, what Brian Stelter does, Oliver Darcy at CNN. They focus heavily on their political enemies, and worse still, their corporate rivals, targeting other businesses that are doing better and getting them shut down. They do. And I'm not just talking about Alex Jones, because if you listen to my show, you'll know I mentioned Mathic Media. CNN targeted a news organization that did absolutely nothing wrong and broke no rules, and Facebook suspended them because CNN reached out. It's a dirty little trick that these journalists do. Journalism has been almost entirely replaced by activism, and it's because of social media. And that explains Jim Acosta's behavior. It explains why these companies, choose to report on certain issues. Again, I mentioned the nuance. It's not black and white. But think about it. Think about what's going to get shared on Facebook. Shock content, rage content. It's what works. You can think about how people view social media. There's no checks. It's agenda-driven and opinionated. But that's where news is being sourced. So when these companies continue to go insane, I recommend you watch my video from yesterday where I talked a little bit about this too. As these companies collapse, they're being driven insane, not because they're actually out of their minds, but because they're desperate to survive. They're desperate, so they say, you know what? In this story, they bring up a quote. I want to make sure I get the name right. Rebecca Schneid, co-editor of the high school newspaper at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland. She appeared on CNN saying, I see a lot of Parkland students becoming activists, but you were all there as journalists. I'm sorry, that was Brian Stelter who said that. Observed about Schneid and other students of the school paper. The Eagle Eye, who were covering the protest, the march drew more than 200,000 people to advocate for gun control less than 6 weeks after the event at Parkland. Do you see a difference right now between journalism and activism in what you are doing? She said, I think that for me, the purpose of journalism is to raise the voices of people who maybe don't have a voice, and so I think that in its own right, journalism is a form of activism. She went on to qualify her statement saying, there is a distinction for me as a journalist and also someone who wants to demand change. But I think the partnership of the two is the only reason that we are able to make change. People are outraged by this statement. The story from Neiman says, many people on Twitter erupted saying journalism is covering a story and giving us the facts and allowing us, the reader or viewer, to make up our mind. People say that there's no objectivity in journalism. And again, I mentioned that's an excuse. one of the arguments they have is that because I choose to highlight these things, that's framing the narrative. And that's fair to a certain extent, but it doesn't mean I'm not objective. Unfortunately, this sentiment you can hear from this young woman is the sentiment we see from people like Jim Acosta at the highest levels, who flat out says neutrality for the sake of neutrality during the Trump era is you can't do it. He says it doesn't serve us in the age of Trump. Unfortunately, he's not doing that job. He's grandstanding and he knows it. He's not challenging the president. He's not challenging the executive branch. He's wasting time and putting himself front and center so he can sell books. And this is a better example of what journalists have become. Joining in on the latest hot take, attacking people like Dave Rubin because it's just the trendy thing that other journalists are doing, and it doesn't make sense. In reference to Dave Rubin, they'll simultaneously complain he doesn't host enough people on the left, and then when Dave reaches out to someone on the left, they attack that individual and try and get the interview shut down. And this should show you that at least, and these are journalists who are doing this, and when we look at the fake quotes being paired, when we look at Covington, it should be plain as day. When, at this point, the veil has been lifted, and we know. At least we should know. We should know better. I'm surprised that, well, I should say this was 2 years ago in this PDF. 2 years ago that people actually, 40% had some trust in media. But it's been going up and down. And as I showed you, trust is down, and that's not surprising. It is unfortunate. We do need people to inform us to the best of their ability, but we're not getting that. There are some great journalists. There are many, many great journalists. The industry doesn't support them anymore. So I absolutely lament the demise of journalism. I think it's sad and it's unfortunate. But I will point out, these people like Jim Acosta and these other activists are wearing the mask of journalist and then demanding your sympathy. They're saying, hey, our company is hurting. You should support us. No. Your company is hurting, and you've started replacing real journalists with these people, with people like this. So essentially, what I wanted to highlight in this video is, when Jim Acosta comes out and says, you know what, I know what I'm doing. What else is there to say? When we can see how, real issues that affect us are not being covered, with some caveats, then you know. And when you see CNN straight up have this conversation where they talk about journalism as activism, well, here we are today. Journalism is activism, and the veil is being lifted. Thankfully, we have social media to highlight this stuff, but you know what? I'll leave it there. You decide, I guess, right? I would end by saying I know I play a role in media, absolutely. I'm not perfect. I try to be as objective as a human can be. It exists. But there is some responsibility on you to try and follow other sources and not just listen to me, listen to other people. Take it for what it is. Thanks for hanging out. Stick around. I'll have more videos coming up later today starting at 6 p.m. youtube.com/TimCastNews. For those listening on the podcast, more will follow shortly, and I will see you then.